Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another author interview here on the channel. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And today we have a very special episode here on the channel. My guest is not only a first timer here on the channel, she is also a fellow historian whose interests align with mine. My guest today specializes in medieval literature, having earned her doctorate from Louisiana State University. Her research interests include critical animal studies, eccentricism, and literature from the High Middle Ages, which is 1000 to 1300. Excavating the lives of marginalized and forgotten individuals, my guest writes fiction that reconstructs the stories that history has underrepresented. She remains a long-standing member and contributor to the literacy communities that shape her as a writer, the Jersey City writers and the provocateurs of Esoterotica. I probably butchered. I apologize. A committed
Okay.
educator, she teaches academic writing and literature courses to university students. Her works have been published in a variety of literacy journals, anthologies, and through independent presses. Currently, she lives in Philadelphia with her partner, her son, and a little cat named Polka. And in this episode, we'll be talking about her book, Chivalry in the Shadows, which, if you haven't seen it on Instagram, it's a very interesting premise. And to tell us all about that and more, let's give a huge round of applause to Dr. Meg Wahlberg. Meg, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Gabriel. It's nice
Awesome.
to get to talk to you today.
Nice.
So I've been writing for forever. I mean, since I was 12 years old. I've always loved writing books, and when I got to university, I decided I wanted to make books, and I sort of fell in love with the process of making books, binding them, learning about different ink types. And I ended up a medievalist, as it turns out.
Mm,
So that's
nice.
my journey.
So, what can you tell us as a little teaser of your book, Chivalry? Because reading it on Amazon, the premise is very, very fascinating.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So it's set in 13th century Brittany, and it's about a young noblewoman named Rowan who learns that her dearest friend and companion, Lady Amorous, is going to have to marry whichever knight wins the midsummer tournament. And so she's worried about her friend and she asks her brother Roland to fight for her. But as the tournament draws near, Rowan starts to realize that she is, in fact, in love with her friend.
Mm.
And this novel explores the bond between the two twins and how their relationship is placed under strain as they both become romantically entangled with the same woman.
Wow, that is really, really interesting. And I imagine a lot of research went into crafting this story because I would imagine since this is during the Middle Ages, this topic is definitely for the people during that time period a little bit taboo. So I'm very intrigued of how you sort of balanced it out. But before we go into that, let's talk a little bit more about your background. So how did you sort of get interested in medieval history and become a medievalist?
In my undergraduate studies, I read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and
Ooh,
that
okay.
poem was just so um, enveloping and haunting, and it stayed with me for many years after I graduated. And so I started reading Chrétien de Troyes and Arthuriana, and I thought I taught a class to SAT prep students, and I thought I really like teaching. I think I want to go back to school and do medieval literature, and so that's why I took that route.
Nice. And what was the aha moment for you in sort of like the inception of chivalry? How did that story come about?
Oh yeah, I was actually on a bus going to the Women's March, and I listened to an audiobook by Sarah Waters called
Hmm.
Breaking the Velvet. Um, and it was just such a beautiful story. And I thought it was like an aha moment for me of like, why don't we have more non-heteronormative tales in mainstream fiction? Like that was the only one at that time that I even was aware of. And so I thought, like, we need more people writing about queer people and telling these stories. And as a medievalist, I thought I should bring my expertise in history to this conversation and expand the stories throughout the historical timeline and kind of like
Right.
speculate on what these relationships looked like and how they worked.
Awesome. So now let's actually dive a little bit more into chivalry and the writing process. So when you began writing the initial draft of chivalry, were there any goals that you had in mind when creating the story? And also, what was sort of the need you wanted to satisfy for your future readers?
I think my main goal going into it was making sure that people felt seen. So often, fiction kind of only portrays the dominant culture and it pushes a lot of people into the margins. And so I wanted to bring those characters to the forefront of the story and and do them justice and create a story that presented them as unique human beings with complex relationships with their family. And ultimately, these two women have to navigate their love for each other amidst their duty to their families in this very rigid feudal society.
Definitely. And for those who don't know, like the history behind that, which we will touch on later, was very, very strict. Doesn't matter if you were highborn or lowborn, you had a role that you were expected to play out. And there were many people who fought against that, both men and women. But unfortunately, their stories don't get a lot of recognition. And I would imagine writing this story, you were almost doing what you said in like your bio, that you want to give a voice to the underrepresented, to give them their agency, their purpose. And I think that's a really great thing to do. So now, after writing the initial draft and now in the editing phases, what was the initial response like from friends and family and feedback? Was it positive, negative, or mixed?
Yeah, so I have been working on this book for I think 3 to 4 years now.
Wow.
It has been through so many waves of criticism and feedback. In the first wave, there was a lot of concern with one of the characters, Amaris, that she
Mm,
wasn't fully fleshed out enough. I was unfortunately falling into that trope of chivalry, putting her up on the pedestal and presenting her as this like this ideal. And so in my second draft, which I took like a year to write,
hmm.
I added a whole narrative from her point of view and really fleshed her out. And then I had beta readers read it. I had about 15 of them, and they loved it. It was really positive reception. The kind of reception I had never gotten on a book before. Usually it was just very like, oh, yeah, this is great. It's well written. But people would forget about it. With
Right.
this round, people were saying, I want to read it again. Like, I don't even know what to say.
That's really good. That is really, really great. I would imagine that feedback, in a way, validated your goal, setting out in the beginning, as I said, with this story, that you wanted to tell not just a great story, but you also wanted to be historical, but also touch on topics that really don't get a lot of representation in the fiction world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nice. Now we're going to touch on a personal topic, which I think you may have some experience on, or may have some topics on, which is when creating a book, it is a nerve wracking feeling. There's a lot of anxiety to it. It's years upon years of drafting, editing, finding a cover artist, finding an editor. it's all this anxiety that's building up, and then presenting it on the digital stage, the anxiety is elevated to a 10. And you never know if it's really going to hit the mark with your readers or your audience. And that voice in the back of every creator's mind is saying, this is not going to do well. No one's going to read a story like this. You just wasted your life. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, Meg, have you ever had that sense of like anxiety and if also imposter syndrome? And if not, what has continued to discipline you to tell this story? Because, in your opinion, this is a story that needs to be told.
Yeah, that's a great question. And absolutely, I have grappled with these feelings of doubt and anxiety over putting myself out there, and sharing my work and worrying, is it ready? Is it polished enough? And will it find its audience? And ultimately, I return to that, like, that question of, why am I writing? Why am I doing this? And I just wanted to tell stories, stories that would help me connect with people and help people connect with themselves. And I know that someone is going to read it somewhere. And I share it with my family, my friends. So I feel like I'm getting this validation of getting to express myself. And even if it never, takes off or becomes some huge success, I feel personally rewarded that I've crafted something beautiful for the world.
Awesome. And now this leads perfectly into the business side of being an author. So once you finally got the final draft done, the book is exactly where you want to be, you have the cover, you have everything planned. Now, curious, because of the story and its content, and that this was a passion project for 3 years, did you want to go initially the independent route, or did you want to try your hand at traditional publishing? And looking back on that decision from the beginning, with everything you've learned up to now, would you still make the same decision?
Yeah, so I spent only about 6 months querying, and I had some manuscript requests, but they ultimately said that I actually remember an agent writing this specifically to me. She said, "There's nothing wrong with your book per se, it's just set too far back in history." And I think as a historian, I took that as a challenge, like, well, I'm going to make this chapter of history more interesting to the general public, and do more work illuminating it, even if traditional publishers aren't interested in doing so. Um, so I like being an independent author, and I think it places me as part of the history of self-published authors. That's
Hmm.
really cool. Like Anais Nin, Walt Whitman, they were self-published. Um, and I one of my heroes is William Morris, who created his own press, the Kelmscott Press, and he researched
Okay.
all these ways to make his own books through medieval bookmaking. So he would get like pigskin and like sheepskin and create his own bindings. And he used this like German recipe for medieval ink so that he could use his own ink. And I've always loved that idea of just doing things because you want to make something beautiful.
Definitely 100%. And I have to agree. And also like to call out on whatever, since the agent said like it's too far in the past. There have
Yeah.
been many other books that I have read that have been set during the Hundred Years' War, ancient Greece, ancient Rome. So I was like, really too far in the past? There are many other books that are set in classical antiquities that are on the shelf. So I don't know. That statement kind of irked me a bit, but to each their own. But
Yeah. It's their
ultimately,
loss.
yeah. But ultimately, being an independent author and also an historian who writes historical fiction is a very amazing, and I myself know exactly that feeling. My first, well, I should say, my second book was alternative history and historical fiction, which was really something new for me because I had never ever written anything set during the classical age, and it was a challenge for me. I
Mm.
really had to put my knowledge to the test, which I'm sure you definitely had to do with chivalry to actually show I know what I'm talking about. This is my area of expertise, and this is my research. And speaking of research, another thing that is important on the business side of being an author is the audience. Now, in the historical fiction genre, you have world history, medieval history, modern history, you even have historical romance, and so forth. So there's a lot of other subgenres within
Mhm.
historical fiction. And I'm curious, Meg, for you in your research, how important was it for you to really understand who your audience is? And in your opinion, how important is it for an author to really understand their audience? Because I bring this up because we're the initial target audience of our books. We know our books better than anyone else. But when we share it with others, we really have to understand, okay, who exactly are we marketing to?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think initially my thoughts were that this is for the LGBTQ community. But I am also involved in a lot of historical reenactment groups who focus on sort of learning about and reenacting the history of war. And this book is based in a lot of research on tournaments, tournament rules, culture,
Hmm.
armor, weaponry. Um, and so I think it appeals to both audiences in that sense because it's telling the story of queer people historically, but also it's giving you a lot of information and knowledge about how tournaments were run and
Right.
the kinds of combat people engaged in.
Nice, very nice. And now going to the next question, which I'm very intrigued to hear your thoughts on. Now, as authors, we're always inspired by, stories that we've read growing up that have really helped us hone our own voice as an author in terms of characters, world building, narrative style, prose, etc. But one thing previous guests of mine brought to attention, which is, as I'm sure you've seen, make the tagline, the next J.K. Rowling, the next George R. Martin, and so forth. Now, from a reader's perspective, that is enticing, that's intriguing. But from an author's perspective, it's not really helpful because it's giving the reader a false sense of what to expect because it may not play out exactly how the book would be. Yes, it will say next George R. R. Martin. That doesn't necessarily mean the author that you're reading is going to write exactly like George R. R. Martin. His characters are not going to be exact same, or her characters are not going to be the same thing. So this is a two-parter. And the first part is, what authors would you say have really helped you sort of hone your voice as an author? But also, the second part, how important is it as an independent author to really show authenticity in terms of this is who I am? I'm not trying to be like anybody else. I'm not so and so. I'm not this. When you pick up my book, this is what you expect.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can tell you who my heroes are, and they have definitely shaped me as a writer. When I was growing up, it was Mervyn Peake. He wrote Gormenghast, a fantasy series, um, and I was just obsessed with his style and his world building. And later, it was Neil Gaiman, and then Sarah Waters, as I mentioned before.
Hmm.
And then in the last couple of years, I've gone through a phase of being obsessed with Madeline Miller, who wrote Song of Achilles,
Okay.
Circe. Her prose style is so beautiful, and I certainly aspire to write in a way that is as well crafted and shows such mastery. But I wouldn't say I'm emulating any of these people. I think they inspire and influence me, but at the end of the day, I'm kind of stuck with my own style,
Right.
and I'm not like ashamed of that. I think that's why we make art, because we're
Hmm.
exploring our style and enhancing ourselves through just practice, constant practice of it.
Definitely. And that actually ties perfectly to the next question, which is readership. Now, when I bring up readership, I feel it is different from the audience because the audience is a very broad topic, broad group. Readership is very specific. It's very fine tuned because for me, the readership really tells me who exactly is reading this, whether it's new adults, young adults, and sometimes that is the most challenging aspect of where does your book really fall into? Because I'm sure you definitely agree, Meg, there have been some books that have been marketed for one group, but upon reading it, it's kind of on the other side.
Mhm.
So for chivalry in particular, where do you sort of find in terms of readership? Do you find it more so like in the middle for young adults and new adults and adult fiction readers can enjoy? Or is it more so of the new adult and adult fiction category?
I think it's definitely falling in the range of new adult to adult. I've looked at the like schematics of where my readership falls, and
Hmm.
it's predominantly women ages 25 up through like 70, just going all across the board. Actually, one of my oldest fans was a woman who was 100 years old.
Really?
Yeah, she loved my last novel, my Sky Pirate one. Unfortunately, she has passed away.
Oh.
That was my oldest fan. But yeah, getting back to your question of readership, I think my novel appeals to people across the board because it has a diverse cast and it explores a lot of different angles of this story. But the numbers say it's predominantly women who are older.
All right, all right. And now another business question. This one I tailored specifically for this interview. As an historical fiction writer, in your opinion, what are sort of like the challenges of trying to, blend fiction styles and fiction prose with history? Because I've seen a lot of writers and a lot of authors sort of struggle with that, where they don't want to drown the reader in a lot of academic, the history side, but they also don't want the story to be very bland and generic. So, how did you sort of balance the two to where you learn about a particular time period, in this case, the tournament history in Brittany, but also craft an engaging story?
Yeah, that is definitely a very delicate dance that we have to do as
Hmm.
historical fiction writers. And I remember having some trouble with this with beta readers. They pointed out sections where it's like, okay, we don't need to know all of the nuances of like the Third Crusade. Like, why is her dad talking about the Third Crusade for a whole chapter? So I found little ways to kind of work it in where it's like you catch snippets of things that maybe a bard is singing in a pub, or there's more subtle references throughout while you're getting actual scenes of dialogue and storytelling. And I really step back from the info dump of like, here's how the tournament rules work. Instead of like having just the rules listed off before the fight begins, you kind of see the fight unfold, and then it's like someone is asking their father or brother, wait, like why was he penalized there? And then they explain very
Mm.
quickly, so you don't like lose the tension of the scene.
All right. And sort of following on to that, in terms of queer representation in chivalry, how did you sort of like present these characters to where they are authentic, they are their true selves, and making sure not to fall on the tropes of how these characters are depicted in other fiction works or in other historical fiction stories?
Yeah, I've read a lot of criticism that helps me sort of understand the issues that are happening in mainstream media. Things like always making the queer person the villain, or having a main character who's bisexual, but it's just like something sort of tacked onto them as like an
Mm,
accessory. It's not actually explored in the story at all. So I tried to write my characters as people. They're not perfect, they're flawed. They have desires and wishes that conflict with their duty to their families. And it's a struggle that many queer people face, that I have faced in my own personal life. So I write from experience, and I write just with considerations for the kinds of complexity in people as they come.
nice. Very,
Yeah.
very nice. And it actually leads perfectly into, sorry, the next question, which is a big one. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background for this. Now, I definitely feel for first time authors, either historical fiction, romance, fantasy, whatever, we all want to get our name out there. And sometimes we'll add on elements into our story that are not really needed or necessary, but they're part of, like, what's the clicks, the trends, the tropes that are the most popular. And sometimes we'll add those into our books to try to join the gravy train. And ultimately, what I've learned doing, podcasting for almost a year and a half is two things. Is that for an author, there are two paths: to be an author and to be known as an author. For me, to be an author is an individual dedicated to the art of storytelling, where capital is not really the main drive, but it's nice to earn some. The second one, to be known as an author, is an individual who's dedicated to the art of marketing, promoting their books on social media platforms, going on interviews, and so forth. Now, each of these have their own hurdles and trials, but I definitely feel for first time authors, it's easy to slip into the second one, to be known as an author, and add all of those unnecessary things just to join the high train. Almost what you were talking about with queer representation, how in other works they'll add on these little unnecessary things that are not really necessary or important or integral to the character or story. It's just there to join the clicks or trends. And sometimes that is not really good. And that in turn affects the long term goals of an author, which is this very hard truth. No matter what you do, whether it's your first book, your second book, or specifically your first book in general, it does not guarantee the start of your legacy as an author. Now, there are exceptions to that rule. Of course, there are authors whose first works launched them to award-winning status, and that is a huge accomplishment. But generally speaking, for first-time authors, their debut work is not going to be the start of their legacy, as I said before. They may have their high moments, but they'll also have their low moments. And unfortunately, if they're trying to make a living off of their first book, that passion is going to die. And they're no longer going to be interested in the art of storytelling. So, Meg, in your opinion, how important is it for first time authors to really understand this concept, that there is no guarantee in the publishing world that their debut book is going to be the start of their legacy, but it should not deter them from telling stories if they're truly dedicated to the art of storytelling?
Yeah. I think that's an important thing for authors to know going into publishing, that yeah, they might not get the kind of reception they were hoping for, or the kind of financial success they were hoping for. A figure who comes to mind is Herman Melville.
Mm,
He wrote beautiful, beautiful travel stories and Moby Dick, and he saw very little financial success in his lifetime. But he was so passionate about the craft, and you can see that passion in his prose. And that that passion is worth pursuing,
right.
regardless of the reception. I think we need more stories in the world. I think the world can never have enough stories, especially with
Right.
AI on the rise, sort of like drowning out human voices. We need more human
Mm-hmm.
voices now than ever. And so I hope people will continue to pursue like authorship and publishing despite the daunting odds against them.
Yes, definitely. And also to add on to that, grit transforms into talent because,
Exactly.
as one of my guests said, and this was a year ago, her debut book, or rather the book that really got her name out there, and this is Natalie Wright's, and her book was Season of the Dragon. I found out that was her seventh book. I was under the impression that was her first book. No, it was her seventh book, and her seventh book is what really got her name out there, and that it is okay. For us authors, we only get better with time, honing our craft, really fine tuning our writing style. Maybe our seventh, 10th, or 20th book, whatever it may be, they're going to find it. And by they, I mean our fans and our readers. They're going to find that book, they're going to love it. And when that happens, we can tell them, hey, if you enjoyed this book, see my journey as an author and check out my other books. And ultimately, that is the ultimate goal in the end for any author, is a sense of immortality, because our works are going to outlive us, and they're going to be records of who we were as authors, who we were as individuals. And that, as I said, is the ultimate goal. And also, especially as authors, we learn a lot from other authors as well, especially in the independent community. So, for you, Meg, are there any authors that you would like to give a shout out to who have really helped you understand the industry a little bit better?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's a woman in my group, Jersey City Writers, named Mary Fan. She's a sci-fi writer, and she does like talks for the group every now and then, and tells us about her journey from independent publishing to traditional publishing and all the things she learned. And she has just been so supportive to the group. She actually moderated my workshop for this novel. So
Oh,
shout out to
nice.
Mary Fan.
Awesome. And in addition to that, besides, of course, friends and family, is there anyone else you'd like to give a mention to or a shout out to who has really been in your corner since day one with Chivalry, who has had your back no matter what?
Yeah, actually, my book is dedicated to a dear friend and mentor, Jim DeAngelis, who was one of the figureheads of Jersey City Writers, and he passed away
Nice.
last year,
Oh.
unfortunately. And he was an excellent writer, so devoted to the craft, and just so kind. And he was kind, but also firm, and he gave me a lot of great feedback throughout my development. So shout out to Jim DeAngelis as well.
Awesome. Now we're nearing the final question of this amazing interview. But before we get to that, I do have one very interesting question I want to ask you, Meg. So, looking back at your life now with Chivalry, with the book, have you ever thought to yourself in your own private moments how different your life would be if you did not bring this story to life?
Oh, I think I would have been much more depressed in grad school. I wrote this at the same time that I was writing my dissertation for my PhD, and it kept me sane. It also helped me really flesh out the corners of the time period that I was writing about in my dissertation. So I think I would be much more disorganized as a scholar and much more just depleted as well.
All right. And you know what? I completely agree. And you know what? You and I were actually in the same boat. My first book, The Gathering, was written also during the same time of my graduate studies, and that kept me sane throughout the process, as well as writing the sequel book to it. So I completely agree. And now we've arrived at the final question of this amazing interview. And here is the final question, Meg. With everything you've learned and still learning about the industry of being an independent author, what is your word of wisdom to other authors and writers who are watching this video right now, who have a story in their head, but they don't know how to share it with the rest of the world?
I would say that story that's inside of you has immense value. And right now, it's like an uncut gemstone, just like sitting within. And if you take the time to just put it on the page and work at it a little each day and just chip away at that stone, eventually you're going to have a beautiful glimmering diamond. So I'd say go for it.
No perfect words ever spoken. 100% agreed, Meg. And we've now arrived at the end of this incredible interview. I want to give a big thank you to our guest, Meg Wahlberg, for coming on the show and
Thank you.
telling us a little bit about her background as a medievalist, as well as her book, Chivalry. Now, Meg, where can people find and engage with you on social media, as well as purchase a copy of Chivalry?
Yeah, so my social media is medieval merit. Um, it's on Instagram, and I'm happy to DM with anyone who wants to talk about writing, publishing, or medieval literature. I'm happy to talk about that any day of the week. And my book is available on Amazon. It's as an ebook, paperback, and hardcover. And I have an audiobook coming out this fall, right before Christmas. So I'll be
Nice.
updating on that on my Insta.
I will link all that down below in the description of this video. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for another author interview here on the channel. Again, a huge thank you to our guest, Meg Wahlberg, for coming on the show and telling us all about Chivalry. And who knows, this may not be the last time Meg will be on the channel. Perhaps I will have her again in a historian's interview. We can dive a little bit deeper into Meg's background as a medievalist. But you have to wait and see. And again, thank you all so very much. And one last thing, my viewers and listeners, this is the last week to pre-order a copy of Michael, Last Angel of Earth. Now, if you would like to own this custom print of Michael, Last Angel of Earth, all you have to do is head on over to the link in my bio, either on Instagram or here on YouTube, to pre-order a copy of Michael. Once you do, message me and I will send you this custom cover. And it is, I mean, come on, this is an amazing cover. I would highly recommend anyone to have it. So just remember, as I said, this is the last week to pre-order Michael, Last Angel of Earth. And I'll make sure to add a link down below for those to find it easier. And make sure to like and subscribe and comment down below what was your favorite part of the interview. And as always, it's been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out, wishing you all a wonderful day.